Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I know folks really enjoyed the first panel. I know that I did and learned a lot, and we will hear some consistent themes, particularly around this predicate of this conference, which is truth, how important it is to establish the facts of the problem that we face in an effort to change it. And so I'm delighted to welcome our second panel this afternoon, where we will talk about reckoning with history and moving beyond organizational accountability. Largely, the panelists with us today have expertise in addressing large social conflicts, forms of oppression that are deeply rooted in our society, and in many ways are the cultural glue that help to keep us stuck from making the kinds of changes in our society that are so essential to achieve equity and justice in the world. So I want to focus on the value of historical reckoning, of truth-telling, of how historical documentation, archival practice, and memorialization can be applied effectively to help societies, including our own, reckon with histories of racist harm and violence. And so I want to introduce our panelists this afternoon. Our first panelist to be introduced is Raymond Frogner. He is the head of archives at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation in Manitoba, Canada. Raymond is also the co-chair of the International Council for Archives Committee on Indigenous Matters. He publishes and presents on issues of Indigenous identity, rights, and social memory. Our next panelist is Dr. Roberts. Dr. Andrea Roberts. She is an associate professor of urban and environmental planning and co-director of the Center for Cultural Landscapes at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. She has over 12 years of experience in the public sector, and she founded the Texas Freedom Colonies Project to identify and map disappearing Black settlements beginning in 2014. And our last panelist to be introduced is Mr. Hannibal Johnson. He's a Harvard Law School graduate and author, attorney, and consultant specializing in diversity, equity, and inclusion, human relations, leadership, and nonprofit leadership and management. He currently serves on the federal 400 Years of African American History Commission and has chaired the Education Committee for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. Again, join me in welcoming our panels of experts this afternoon. We're going to get started, as I've shared with each of you in preparation for this panel, with understanding examples from your own experiences with either the organizations that you've worked for directly or with, in terms of how they've made significant progress in addressing racial equity, specifically through historical reckoning. And we want to lift up both the particular context from which each of you have had these experiences and also the key factors that have contributed to your success or the organization's success. So Dr. Roberts, why don't you get us started?
So a lot of my work, even though I'm in urban and environmental planning, that's the area I teach in, I have this background that really comes a lot out of working with communities in the context of government. So I was a deputy budget director for the city of Philadelphia, and I was a planner with the city of Houston. And in all those capacities, what I saw was a lack of reckoning with the public history and how that informs landscapes and the way we treat certain landscapes or places. And the way that I saw that happen is a lot of erasure or just presumed, what I call presumed placelessness. So if we're looking at any given urban community, I would see areas where African Americans are located, referred to as being concentrations. This is where they're concentrated, right? We're all familiar with that kind of HUD language, right? And sure, it has something to do with density, but it doesn't have anything to do with sense of place, what places mean to the residents. So this sort of alienating kind of sense that I had when I was trying to go out to communities and talk to them about federal funding, and I would say, hey, we have this federal funding available. And they say, well, you're talking to me, but you haven't talked to my neighbor, and you haven't talked to that community, and that community has a name, by the way. And we've been around for a very long time. So there were all these stories that I was privy to. I was starting to get a consciousness about a place that I had grown up from. I'm originally from the Houston area. And at the same time, I was having this reckoning with my own family history. So if you could imagine going to work every day and seeing people look at communities a particular way, and then losing people in my family and facing the fact that we all get older, right? And that people aren't going to be around forever. So through that experience, I began to spend more time with family, learn about historic sites that I didn't think were historic sites, like Riceville Community, which is a family, the place where my father's side of my family came from, and Fifth Street, another historic settlement. Most of these places founded between 1865 at the earliest to 1930. And so I began to learn more about these communities and wondered, okay, I hear about Fourth Ward, I hear about Independence Heights. I know there are two in my own family. I'm not seeing the city talking about these places. And I began to want to learn more about how many of these places were around, why I wasn't seeing the representation of them in the planning process, in the decision-making process, and why it wasn't a regular part of our foundational story of the story of Texas or the story of Houston. And the more I begin to kind of examine historical, theses, and I would see, a little mention here and there, and finally started accumulating a list of these places. And so the reckoning that I've been facilitating or trying to make possible this whole time is making people see places that are largely invisible to them if we are looking at the standard of having a historical marker, if we're looking at the standard of them being on a map, if we're looking at them as a standard of being taught in a Texas history class. And freedom colonies, historic Black settlements weren't showing up in any of those. So the reckoning that I've been trying to facilitate is getting my field, both the people who teach and the practitioners, to know these places exist, that they have stakeholders that matter and that still care about these places, and that they should be showing up. Because when they don't show up, they're erased, they're not considered, and we have them bifurcated by freeways, and we know the rest of it. So that's sort of how it showed up in my work, the way that I've kind of come into historical reckoning.
That's very powerful. And I have a lot of things I've been thinking about. And thank you so much for at least starting the conversation about how you got into your work. I'm going to move to Mr. Johnson to learn. There's obviously some symmetry, I think, between your work in Tulsa and Dr. Roberts' work in Houston.
So I'm a big fan of alliteration. So I would say that racial reckoning for me involves kind of a tripartite process of acknowledgement, apology, and atonement. And so I've worked in the community in a number of different ways, but I just want to focus on my work on the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. That was a body created by Oklahoma Senator Kevin Matthews in 2015. It was designed to commemorate what I would consider to be an emblematic act of domestic racial terrorism, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. So I chaired the education committee and also served as local curator for the Black History Museum that we built and opened in 2021. I would say that we scored progress on a couple of significant fronts. One is education, and the second is economic development. In terms of education, we worked with the local school district and the state to reform the curriculum such that this history would be a required part of curriculum materials. We created a summer teachers institute to teach teachers from Oklahoma the substantive history, but also pedagogy. How do you teach this history at various age levels and in various disciplines? We also, as I mentioned earlier, opened Greenwood Rising, the museum, which is really a teaching experience for all ages. In terms of economic development, Greenwood Rising allowed us to leverage cultural tourism, which is a growing phenomenon across the nation. We partnered with the city on a number of economic development initiatives, and we also raised money through philanthropic engagement to offer small grants to entrepreneurs and people who had economic initiatives and ideas. So those are the primary areas in which we worked. I would say that key to our relative success were a number of factors. One is that we started out as a diverse coalition, including governmental officials, just regular citizens, even descendants of race massacre victims. We emphasized diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, in everything that we did. We made great strides to hear all community voices, even those voices who were detractors from the work that we were trying to do. And finally, we placed great emphasis on consensus-driven outcomes from among the commission. So those are the real keys to our, and I'll say again, relative success. We certainly weren't 100% successful, but I think we achieved a lot.
Well, those are some really powerful examples, and again, echo some of the work that my colleague, both Erica Licht and Dr. Gloria Ayi, whom I know, Mr. Johnson, you met both of them in gathering research for our project, which looks internationally at some of these same dynamics. So we're going to come back to some of those key factors, because I certainly want to talk a little bit more about them. So just in the way of getting to know each of you, Raymond, you're going to tell us about your work at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. This is a story of the history of Indigenous dispossession, as well as the erasure of Indigenous culture. And so the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think it's interesting to begin by just noting that the 20th century began with the notion that Indigenous peoples were being erased, and it was legitimately thought of as an idea of social progress to have the full and complete assimilation and erasure of Indigenous peoples into the Canadian polity. The century ended by a recognition that Indigenous peoples are, in fact, community rights-bearing peoples within the Canadian Constitution. And it's that journey across the 20th century that I think is the story that we're trying to tell and acknowledge. I really like Mr. Johnson's alliteration, acknowledgement, apology, and atonement. And I do think that is, in a sense, what we're trying to do. Over time, as Indigenous peoples began to get recognition, first internationally through things such as the post-war recognition of human rights over states' rights, and the development of the constitutional rights-bearing communities within Canada. I think as that evolved, Indigenous people began to more successfully manifest their rights within courts and demand for their recognition. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was struck in 2007, is actually that kind of acknowledgement. It was thought of as a truth-based commission. It didn't have the power of subpoena. It didn't have the power to call in for arrest of perpetrators of crimes that happened at residential schools. And just for a slight bit of context, residential schools began in the late 19th century, and approximately as thought of 150,000 Indigenous children were sent through that program for the purpose of assimilation. And today there is somewhat of a debate over whether it can be thought of as genocide. Our position at the center is, in fact, it is. Terms such as cultural genocide and physical removal and destruction have been tossed around, but I think it's an artificial distinction to talk about the distinction between a cultural genocide and a total erasure of a community, their identity, their well-being. So our position is that it is, in fact, a kind of a genocide, and that acknowledgement and understanding is the first step towards a recognition. Which is what I think Mr. Johnson was referring to. So we are based on the idea that we're doing research to acknowledge, understand, and go forward from that journey from the notions of total erasure to rights-bearing communities. And just one final thought, I mean, I always like to refer to P.G. McHugh, Cambridge historian of Aboriginal jurisprudence, who likes to say that the origin of the term Aboriginal, ab origine, is there at the beginning. to which I would always respond, the beginning of what exactly? For a very long time, Indigenous peoples have been defined by settler devices, particularly legal treaties, the Indian Act, the Constitution. What we're striving to do is try to decolonize these relationships so that Indigenous peoples are defining themselves on their own terms, their own cultural signposts. So that's more or less what we're striving for.
Wow, this is such a rich set of examples, in part because while they share significant aspects in common, there are three really different approaches to historical reckoning. If I understand everyone correctly, Dr. Roberts, your work begins really with a kind of personal commitment to recovering local histories, to make visible places that have been erased, particularly visible within local and state government. And of course, that work lives outside of the state with an effort to hold the state accountable. And Mr. Johnson, your work sits in between these two efforts because your work essentially has the imprimatur of government in an effort to make some kind of, as you say, acknowledgement, apology, and atonement for one of the most horrific massacres in U.S. history. And in some ways, I think, if I'm hearing Dr. Roberts correctly, had buy-in from, a kind of both sides, people who were actual survivors of the massacre, as well as people who opposed recovering this history, of making it visible. And then finally, just a summary for these opening comments, so Raymond, you take us not only across the borders of the United States, but internationally to establish essentially what are the legal frameworks growing out of human rights efforts around various truth commission and truth telling or tribunal processes, and then applying them to one of the oldest stories of domination, or as you say, cultural genocide, to the case of Indigenous people in North America. And yet, again, the effort of recovery, as you say yourself, sounds very similar to what has been going on for Mr. Johnson and for Dr. Roberts. So I want to talk a little bit about the challenges in this work, because I think it's important to start with the extent to which what you've done has yielded something positive and as a measure of success. But part of learning and teaching others who are doing something along these lines, doing this work or considering doing it, is to recognize resistance. So I want to talk about what that resistance looked like. And I want to start with you, Dr. Roberts, on this question, because
Sure.
one of the things that came to mind when listening to you is, what was the first conversation or an early conversation you had as an urban planner? You said you were an alienated urban planner. So, give us a little bit of the texture of what it meant to try to bring these histories to bear on local decision making, which had huge consequences for the people affected by housing, for example.
Yes. So I would say that the big challenge in all of that is about what's data, what counts as data, what counts as history. And so in order to see these places, my initial conversation that helped me to see the significance of the place, my community of origin, where my father grew up, in order to see these as important places. And if they didn't show up the map, what was my proof? Okay, so there was oral history. Then there were baggies full of funeral programs and ephemera under my grandmother's bed that would have obituaries and information about people who had passed and would mention the name of different communities, of mutual aid societies. So there was a whole kind of community architecture that was able to become legible to me if I looked in records, if I looked in or listened to stories from people that wouldn't ordinarily be in the planning space. These were people you saw in the planning space when it was time at the end of a planning process, right?
And just a pause on that.
Sure.
Is that an example of the kind of symbolic inclusion, meaning all the decisions have been made, and at the end do a little public song and dance? Okay.
Exactly. So yes, so we're all finished. We figured out the plan. Let's get some input. But what I was beginning to see after doing extensive research, once I decided to drop everything at the city and go back and get a PhD and just think about nothing but finding all these places and understanding what happened to them, is finally was able to accumulate a list of place names, 557 names of places created by Black folks in the state of Texas alone. So let's just sit with that for a second.
Can I ask to clarify, at 550, are these places that were officially designated, or there's a combination of places that that claim their own zip code, for example?
Great question. So I started with that list of names by county that were assumed to have been created between 1865 and 1970 by Black folks. Independent sovereign places, not a neighborhood people were pushed to, an actual place. And so what really became the challenge is, how do you substantiate all of these? Because if you have nothing but a name of a place and you may not have any structures left there, then what is it that you're actually saying this is? It's a place, it's a landscape. Why does it matter? What's the factor? Who are the stakeholders? So answering all those questions became the big challenge, and actually answering them in such a way that it would translate to people who work in the field. And that's why I began mapping all of those places using that ephemeral information. When we had no public record for about 200 of those places, I've spent the last few years going to communities and having an online place for people to share evidence of place. And then for practitioners to then say, before they go out into the field and do a survey, or before they go out into the field and say, is this historic, or are we going to harm this place? There's a very public place where you can see, at least at this time, 489 of the 557. So we see a larger footprint in a reckoning with what was and what we don't see anymore, and having to ask why that is. And then also promoting an accountability then for these places, because now we can see them and we have to reckon with their current condition and the future we want with them, along with the rest of the state of Texas.
Okay, wow. So you started to get in accountability. So we're going to hold that for the last round of these initial questions, because I am chomping at the bit to hear exactly what you all set in place. I'm going to come to you now, Mr. Johnson, because one of the things that I think is interesting between Dr. Roberts' work and your own is, it sounds like Dr. Roberts, mostly the work of historical recovery is community-centered, meaning you're largely working with Black Houstonians who are opening their homes as archives to you in order to create this database, which I will argue, part of colonialism is the absolute erasure, not only of people's histories, but also to define what is acceptable data to be made, as both you and Raymond have suggested, legible lives. So, Mr. Johnson, your case is interesting because you're actually working with a white community one way or the other, precisely because the state played a bigger role, or the city of Tulsa played a bigger role. So let's talk a little bit about what resistance looked like in the beginning as you set out, to do this work.
Interestingly enough, I want to sort of focus on Black resistance.
Great.
Most of the major tension here was within the context of the Black community, and it really centered on how you define the word reparations. So I always define it broadly to include both individual payments to individuals for as recompense for harm, but also community investments, things like education, things like building a history center, or forms of reparation in my mind. There are a few very vocal people here who narrowly circumscribe the definition of reparations to mean cash payments for particular individuals. And that was their priority. And since we were focused on other forms of reparation as our priority, they were resistant to us. In fact, there are still a few people who say that they refuse to set foot in Greenwood Rising, this new history center that we've built, precisely because they think that we were somehow puppets of the white power structure and all that. I mean, those are some of the things that you sort of invite when you create a diverse coalition that includes governmental officials and philanthropists and people from all walks of life. So that is one area of resistance that we encountered and continue to encounter to some degree. The other area that I would highlight is what I would refer to as moral consistency. So we had a broad coalition, again, that consisted of governmental officials. Most of the high-ranking government officials in the state of Oklahoma are very conservative people. And just to be blunt, they're conservative Republicans. So at the time that some of these people were working with us on the commission, the insurrection happened, anti-CRT legislation happened, all these things happened. So we were barraged by demands that these people step aside from the commission because of, again, what I'm framing as issues of moral consistency. And so we sort of had to deal with that. And those are uncomfortable places to be in, but we had to work through it, through the resistance, to achieve what we were focused on, which is our mission, which is to reform the curriculum primarily, and to build a history center that told the story of the Greenwood community, not the story of the massacre, the story of the community writ large, which includes a key element of entrepreneurship and economic development.
So I wanted to unpack a little bit this reparations issue, because I could just say very quickly, the work in South Africa, of course, which has been a model to varying degrees in other parts of the world. Rwanda, for example, Northern Ireland sent a team to South Africa to understand precisely what went on there, and many other places, including the United States and the Kellogg Foundation's work around this issue. And it's fascinating because the story of apartheid was narrowly limited in the Truth Commission to specific identifiable victims of forms of police violence that were roughly understood to be beyond the scope of normal policing. That included about 21,000 people who appeared before the commission over a 3-year period, and left out millions of people who were victims of systemic apartheid, including all of the abusive ways in which the state used absolute violence against people. And so the question there about reparations remains to this day, in this moment, a very intensely debated issue, because the issue of community reparations was legislated by the ANC as a way of essentially trying to address the legacy of apartheid, which would include education. And so I mentioned that, Mr. Johnson, because one of the things that's ironic about the Tulsa case, as say may not be as clear in the case of Dr. Roberts, who really is sort of looking at the history of systemic oppression, or in the case of Raymond's story. In your case, you actually did have a city that punted or refused to pay reparations to actual survivors who were alive 30 years ago when legislation or litigation was brought forward. So I just want to understand now, I understand the Black resistance. What was the conversation among government officials who were on board for this, including the conservative Republicans, in at least having to address, either acknowledge directly, we chose not to give money to people who had standing, because I don't know, fill in the blank. So that's the part I wanted to hear a little bit more about.
Yeah, I think the governmental officials involved were fully willing to acknowledge the harm that was done, but they have sort of an out, because you talked about systemic and institutional racism. Well, survivors, more than 20 years ago, there were over 100 survivors alive who filed a federal lawsuit, as you're well aware. But the very legal system that they went to had what I would consider to be facially neutral responses that shut down the lawsuit. A statute of limitations. Statute of limitations was not something that was designed to block Black people from litigating, but in practice, because of the timing of the harm, a statute of limitations worked to preclude those people from seeking their remedy in court. And so the situations in the United States that come most immediately to mind to me where people were accorded cash reparations, those came from the legislative branch. We talk about Japanese internees from World War II and their descendants. The Rosewood Massacre from 1923, the Florida legislature provided cash reparations to those folks. It did not work its way through the judicial system because there are structural barriers within the judicial system to prevent addressing what courts consider to be political questions, like these instances of domestic racial terrorism.
Okay, thank you. Well, this is a good segue to Raymond, because partly what Mr. Johnson is describing is the legal framework in which a constitutive body can decide on its own how to make repair for the past, either through cash payments, through education, through memorialization. And so, Raymond, what was the road to the establishment of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, at least from the perspective of the point at which it came into existence and whatever struggles or resistance opposed its establishment?
Well, it really was the manifestation of Indigenous peoples themselves. As the judicialization of constitutions began to grow, it was no longer just the cabinet and privy council that had decisions made regarding the destiny and the daily lives of Indigenous peoples, that these packages of collective rights could be legitimately brought to court. So by 2005, the class action settlement, the largest settlement in the history of Canadian law, was brought to court with over 79,000 people signing on to claim that there were torts against children who had attended residential schools. So it literally forced churches and the federal government to settle the agreement, which in 2007 was the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. Within that agreement, there was something called the Independent Assessment Process, the IAP process. And that was to address the most egregious cases of abuse, sexual and physical abuse, that occurred at those residential schools. So it's 142, there's been some discussion, there's been many more that weren't recognized, but across the country, 142 schools were identified for this. And 38,000 claimants were passed through the IAP process. Within that process, they were given a settlement with the understanding that they would then not take their claims any further to court against churches or the government. So in a sort of backwards fashion, that was a way that the courts at least brought an end to those cases. However, going forward, nevertheless, it was quite well recognized by then under the Royal Canadian, the RCAP, the Aboriginal study process from 1997, RCAP, as well as the IRSA, that there needed to be a to the courts, outside of this kind of waging lawfare, as many had put it, to more education and reconciliation, which was understood began with acknowledgement. And until recently, there wasn't a single provincial curriculum of any education ministry in the country that actually included the history of residential schools. This, despite the fact it was one of the largest social programs in the history of the nation. That's now changing, but it's been a very slow and gradual recognition and acknowledgement of this history. So it's now a question of education and recognition in order to reset the relationships between settlers and Indigenous peoples within the country on a foundation that's based on ideas of rights, dignity, and equality.
You said so many things that again are puzzling, at least to a US-based practitioner of this kind of work. So if the Indigenous community itself led the effort, which resulted in a national decision to make reparations, as well as to build curriculum that would cover a history that had been deliberately erased, what did they do that was so compelling? And in what moment did lightning strike twice such that this could proceed at the scale that it did. And I know you talked about the broader international human rights construct that applied here. I mean, is it as simple as in the United States, human rights don't mean much when applied inwardly to this country?
No, there was several decisions that occurred. For example, in the 1980s, class actions began to be accepted by provincial courts across the country. So it became possible for class action suits like the one I mentioned that involved 79,000 to be brought to court and to force the government to a response. Also, in the trial of Blackwater v. Plint in 2005, there was a question of what they called vicarious liability, which ruled that the children that did suffer these abuses were suffering them at the hands of churches or priests and missionaries that ran the schools, and that they were sort of vicariously liable for those experiences as well as the government. So that forced those church groups into the settlements as well. Another question was that the sexual offenses in 1982, the criminal code was rewritten to say no consent is obtained where the complainant submits or does not resist by reason of the exercise of authority. So there was a certain in about 20 years pattern of court cases and decisions that led to a pathway of manifestations for the Indigenous peoples within courts that forced the hands of the different authorities that ran the schools. And then since then, we have the records now housed at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Going forward, we want to promote this idea that we are decolonizing, that we're creating this idea that the traditional notion of documented history doesn't really address the sort of cognitive understandings of these communities, that there was a kind of cognitive imperialism in the fact that, this history was only written, that it was the ideas of ceremony, performance, songs, artwork. Those are also mnemonic devices that are used by communities, social protocols, and those have and should have equal values for the memories of these events. And so it's really, we're moving towards social memory away from this traditional concept of a static house of records. It's dynamic. It's a safe place of encounter and self-expression where people can share experiences. And it's no longer just dry files on a shelf. It's moving towards a living memory that will go forward, and that's the kind of foundation that will build a new society that will, have a decolonized relationship between settlers and Indigenous peoples.
Wow. So I'm gonna open to Dr. Roberts and Mr. Johnson if they want to talk to each other for just a second, because I know I have definitely jumped in here a lot. So and Dr. Roberts, I'm thinking that there's a lot been said that you probably have some thoughts on yourself.
I do. Everything that I'm hearing about what is seen as valid and what's legally legible has been such a big piece around my own work. But I would imagine in Mr. Johnson's work, it's been vitally important to not only engage these issues of legal legibility, but also accounting. What has been the accounting through oral history, and how does that intersect with the legal world in terms of people who were actually victims of the massacre and those oral histories, and how is that intersected with the actual process of reconciliation?
So we've actually done a really good job, I would say, in the last 30 or so years collecting those oral histories. There was a statewide commission convened by the governor and the legislature in 1997 called the Oklahoma Commission to Study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. And the eminent Dr. John Hope Franklin was an advisor to that body. They met for 4 years. One of the members of that first commission was a local historian named Eddie Faye Gates, and she interviewed all the living survivors that she could identify and schedule during that period. There were more than 100 living survivors. And so those oral histories, including video interviews, are archived at the Oklahoma Historical Society, and some of them are also at Oklahoma State University. So we have a really good accounting of what the people who were on the ground experienced during that fateful 16-hour period that was the massacre. What we haven't done a good job, and we're doing a better job of now, is making sure that those narratives are infused into curriculum materials so that students get kind of a multifaceted, multi-perspective look at what happened in 1921 and why it's important to us today.
Yeah, that's huge, because I teach planning, history, and theory to master's students. And I teach about the Tulsa race riot. And I asked them, so what do you know about the Tulsa race riot? And it's amazing how little, with all the wonderful documentaries and the books that have been published, how little people still understand, how little they still understand about what happened, and how long it took for people to actually believe it happened.
Well,
And,
the other part of that, I'm glad you mentioned that. The other part of that is really important is that the massacre in Tulsa did not happen in a vacuum. So it's a part of a national context that includes Red Summer, it includes events like Rosewood afterward, it includes domestic terrorism that lynching was during that period. The phrase used by some sociologists and historians, the nadir of race relations in America, applied to this period. I use that all the time because I think it's so accurate. You got to understand the context before you can look at these individual events. And you also have to understand in Tulsa that the massacre is not the be all and end all of the Black community. So when we reached out to the community, when we were creating the Centennial Commission, and we decided that we're going to build a museum or a history center, people in the community said, if you're going to do that, don't make it a massacre museum. We don't want that. We want something that chronicles the history of this rich community that was visioned, built, sustained, and resurrected by Black people. That's what we want. And we know the massacre is a part of that, but it's only a part of that. It's like a chapter of a larger book.
Yes.
Yeah, that explains the name of the museum, Greenwood Rising, as opposed to say the work that Brian Stevenson has done, which I'm a huge admirer of, which is from lynching to mass incarceration, the museum that he has in Montgomery, Alabama, which has, of course, also attempted to link the story of racial terror in the South as a national story. I want to come back to Raymond as a kind of a provocation to you, Dr. Roberts, and to you, Mr. Johnson, and really it's a provocation to myself as well, which is to say, I said at the end of my last remarks to Raymond that is it something particular about the United States, its own settler colonial framework, that has used the law as an impediment to the kind of truth and reconciliation work, be that inclusive of reparations or not, that makes it nearly impossible for this country to draw upon international examples as a pathway for its own future. And I'm asking you, Raymond, because I just want you to be as clear as you can be, to be a little truthful with us. Like, is that our problem, that we are still committed to settler colonialism and its 21st century manifestations? Mr. Johnson has talked about the anti-CRT, although Dr. Roberts hasn't mentioned it. I can't imagine in Texas that some of your work is not banned from being taught in schools.
Well, I would say, in an international scale, these colonial experiences of Indigenous peoples happened across the planet. Similar experiences can be found in New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, in Asia. The fate of the Ainu is well known as well. And to be clear, Canada looked quite closely at what was being practiced in boarding schools in the United States. It looked at some of the Michel Foucault wrote about the schools that were happening that were constructed in 19th century South Africa or North Africa as models of incarceration and rehabilitation of children. So, I mean, this is an international narrative. Why in the United States has gone differently, I think, is just simple local histories. I mean, the common law applied as well across the border. I mean, the Marshall decisions for recognizing Indigenous rights in the United States brought it to more of one of community tribal rights, as opposed to the British approach, which is more of a condescending kind of control over the life of the communities themselves. So we could see, for example, the Indian Act in Canada controlled virtually every aspect of a community's life, from education, birth, death, employment, health. They were all controlled under that act. So when it was brought to court, there was a very clear set of circumstances that could be tried. I think maybe in the United States, because so many tribal communities operated sort of in a sort of self-determining way. They had a bit of independence within their own laws, within their own communities. I'm thinking of Bruce Duthu's work on legal pluralism, plurality. So there was that kind of basic difference, but I mean, fundamentally, this is still a question of dispossession of land and dispossession of rights and identity. And I mean, from what I understand, there's the Department of Interior has written a 2-volume study of boarding schools in the last couple of years that is beginning that same process that Canada had gone through. By all means, I would never suggest that Canada is somehow more enlightened or making better progress than the United States. It's not true. That I think we all are in the same sort of under the same human condition in the same planet, and I mean, we're struggling with the same sort of hierarchies of control and authority that have determined our lives without our consent for generations.
Mm-hmm. I
was going to say, jump in there.
Okay, I would say historic preservation, if we understand it as a professional field, which it is, the professionalism of that field and the way that it began in the United States is very much rooted in a sort of white supremacy that is a valoration of a certain story about the Civil War, a certain story about presidential homes, a certain story about Southern cities. We can see that with ladies who came together to preserve Mount Vernon, with the women who came together that are discussed in the book Race and Reunion about, this need for reconciliation and finding ways in the public spaces to commemorate a false reunion, right? So we have this roots of the field that are rooted in that kind of actions, those type of activities. And then even when it becomes legislative, even when we have the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966, what we have is something that's very much about the built environment, but it's separate from the intangible. And what that has to do with this international, the difference between the international and the American context is the American context is still very fixated on this concept of integrity, meaning physical integrity. If a place is determined to have some sort of historic significance, and if that historic significance matches up to the conditions that you now see of that place, then you have a stronger likelihood of being able to list it on the National Register of Historic Places, or on the local level, which is ironically more important, to list it as a landmark that can then be protected from demolition, right? So what we see a lot in the United States are people on the local level trying to push the envelope and say it's not just about something being 50 years old or older, but it's more about community value, making spaces for people to articulate that community value. So I think the real challenge in the United States, and why I'm so excited about what I'm doing now, which is promoting this idea of cultural landscapes, is because cultural landscapes are about everything. If you look at UNESCO, if you look at other international historic or heritage conservation standards, they encompass traditions, rituals, really more expansive than whether or not this building still looks like it's, preserved in amber. It's significant because something happened in 1960 and it still looks like it's from 1960. And that kind of standard really makes it almost impossible for a lot of the people that I've been talking to about freedom colonies to get recognition and protection or funding, even though we've had great legends like Brent Leggs out there doing everything he can to get money to help save these places. There are these standards that still make it prohibitive and create a preservation apartheid for communities of color who can't afford to make sure the windows look the same way they did in 1960, or any of those sort of standards that really have a class and a race divide in terms of being able to comply with American preservation standards.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. The fight for a museum is the fight for participation in a colonial institution. It's like one of the great ironies of what we're talking about here, and that is only to be honest about the dynamic. So when you say meeting a particular standard for inclusion is very much the conversation happening inside museums today about whose art gets hung on the walls.
Right.
So we have a question from the audience I want to read. The question is this: I am an Asian American daughter of parents who were refugees and exiles. Their refugee camp was in Southeast Asia. How can we second generation children honor our elders' life experiences when there is a third place involved in our family history? The homeland, refugee location, and now the United States. So it's a question about preservation across generations that includes multiple places where people have lived and traced their past.
I can speak somewhat to that, in that the only way that historic preservation occurs or continues in a lot of freedom colonies is because of their traditional annual events, the homecomings, and the Juneteenth celebrations, the church anniversaries. Most of those types of celebrations were actually created around the time of the second or third waves of the Great Migration. And that was to cause people to return. If you cause people to return, you can reinforce their sense of commitment to that place. They go back there to get buried. The point being that these points of times of return remind people that they have multiple places of citizenship and allegiance and commitment and accountability. Mm-hmm. And so I think in an international context that she's describing, I can't exactly speak to that, but I think that there are places or I hate to say concentrations, but diasporic places where people are coming together, and you can build upon that to think about what is the continued communication, what are the continued sort of cultural survivals that are reinforcing connection and commitment, and try to build upon those.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Well, the other thing, I think the simple thing that comes to mind for me is just be sure to cultivate the stories of the elders and document them somewhere and just preserve those is really important.
Thank you. Go ahead, Raymond.
I was just going to add, I mean, in a modern network digital environment, we're looking at the possibility of sharing these stories within a safe sort of ethical space that's digital. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bricks and mortar kind of location. By all means, the events, the location where the events occurred, have their own sort of contextual memory, their own landscape of memory. But there's also that sort of that cognitive understanding of what happened, and that can be preserved in oral histories and shared across communities online, and have some kind of a sort of a digital space of encounter and expression, and not necessarily a bricks and mortar museum to honor that.
So this it might be our last question, depending on your response. So I'm interested in this accountability issue from an infrastructure standpoint. So to varying degrees, all of you have success as defined by some manifestation of historical recovery, preservation, of an educational institution of one kind or another, be it a museum or a center, in your case, the Texas Colonies Project. So is there an accountability mechanism that is also budgetary? Is there, I'll give you a very brief example. When I was at the Schomburg Center, which is itself a cultural institution of preservation, we had a young person's program, a Saturday school, so to speak, for Black Studies. And it was all soft money. It was all foundation money initially, and then some donations. And one of the things I'm proud to say is that over the few years that I was there, I was able to hardline support for that program in the New York City budget, which meant that it would always get an appropriation unless someone literally went in like Ron DeSantis in Florida and carved it out so that it wouldn't be approved by the main budget. So I'm asking, that's one form of accountability. And I'm curious, how do you protect the infrastructures that you've helped to build?
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I would say that for the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, there's been sort of two ways that we've come at accountability. And one is in getting out there and educating practitioners about the utility of it, right? And so that has been able to be used by the type of people who have control over whether or not things are still standing or not. The types of people who go out and are conducting the surveys, right? But when it comes to actual organizations, there's county historical commissions. And those on the county level in Texas are vital to making decisions and allocating funding and priorities on the local level. And so as I do these trainings about this is how you identify these landscapes, this is how you identify these places, I also make it a time to talk about implicit bias and what causes people to see these places and identify them or not. And then also to question why your leadership isn't composed of the people from these places. And they're predominantly white and older and retired, especially people who have the time to do this work. So the work has been about taking these, I have an inch in talk about these places and mapping them and identifying and saving the buildings. But more importantly, how are we changing the face of these organizations? And then also talking to them about changing bias in terms of their budget, where they want to allocate money toward, not just surveys, but actual scholarships for local kids to actually start pursuing careers in historic preservation. So I'm kind of been opening up and getting people to think more broadly about representation as a way of advancing accountability and change.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that it's, in terms of organizational accountability, one thing that organizations can do is some benchmarking. So I've done diversity, equity, and inclusion assessments for organizations so that they know where they stack up against best practices. So one of the things, and most of these are nonprofits, but building racial equity, for example, into the mission, vision, and values, incorporating it into the budget, into the strategic plan, having mechanisms to hold leadership accountable for results, making sure that there's continuous learning around racial equity. Those are all things that organizations can do to hold themselves accountable to certain standards.
Thank you. Raymond, you want to get the last one on this?
Sure. Yeah. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission actually, in its final report, published calls to action, which was a list of ideas and activities that could be done to basically to reconcile colonial Canada moving forward, as I said before, on principles of equality and justice and atonement, a healing and education from this past. So following on those calls to action, as an archivist, there's calls to action 72 to 76, which explicitly talk about residential schools and the records that are held there. So call to action 72 was to create what they called, unfortunately, a death register, but it's a profile of every student that was lost at the school. These profiles are kept exclusively for the access of families. It profiles each child with 15 fields of information, but we commemorate that register with what we call a memorial site online, which, after consultation with the communities, is the information of the name, the date of death, and the school that child attended. And then call to action 73, moving forward, was to create a burial site registry where we're trying to understand unmarked grave sites that are known to exist around these schools. And these are also the cases in American boarding schools. It's not exclusive to Canada, but it is a known fact that many, if not all of the residential schools in Canada had unmarked grave sites located nearby. So we're now going forward with a memorial burial site register where we are identifying these unmarked grave sites. All this to say that we're building and continue to construct a body of information, a body of knowledge that recognizes this past. It can no longer be denied, and that it's a basis on which we can build from going forward to begin to atone, as I said, to heal, and then move forward in a sort of a decolonized kind of society.
Well, Raymond, you may not be willing to say it, but I am willing to say it. You all are further along than we are. So I want to thank everyone for joining us on this panel. Thanks again to Dr. Roberts, to Mr. Johnson, and to Raymond so much for everything that you shared. We did get a couple of questions come in kind of just under the wire. And so although I was able to see them, we didn't have enough time to get to them. So I apologize to those folks. I will try to include some of the spirit of those questions in our final panel this afternoon with Dr. Tatum, who can speak on some of these same issues. Just wanted to let you know that please feel free to share and tag us on Twitter at IARA, IARA_HKS, and LinkedIn with the hashtag Truth and Transformation. We'd love to hear your takeaways for our audience watching. A recording of the session will be available online after the event. We'll also share the resources mentioned during the session, so keep an eye on our social media and newsletter.